I'm going to go ahead and get started. So I want to welcome everyone here and to our live streaming community too. We have, I think, about 30 people online live streaming right now. I just want to tell you a little bit about this whole series. This is the first of two-day workshops on genes and society, decolonizing human genetic research. This project was conceived by a grassroots group here at NC State, being an ally in academics. The focus of this group, which includes faculty, staff, graduate students, and at NC State, was to build a community of folks that wanted to educate themselves about how to be better and active allies, and to address systemic racism and the climate of exclusion within academia. The first step was to identify what NC State was doing about systemic racism and inclusion and how it compared to other universities. And then the group developed a list of action items for the administration about how to improve conditions here at NC State. Following this, the second goal was to build sustainable connections with HBCUs and predominantly Indigenous colleges here in North Carolina. This led to our second initiative, which was supported by the College of Sciences and created this series, Decolonizing Human Genetic Research. This series is co-sponsored. I don't know if that's the right word to use because there's a lot of people involved, with the Genetic Engineering and Society Center, the Genetics and Genomics Academy, and the Triangle Center for Evolutionary Medicine. We have a second series in the spring with the following Share Your Science event in the late spring to connect students at several of our HBCUs with students here at NC State. Before I introduce our esteemed guest, I first want to state that NC State exists on the land that belongs to Indigenous communities, and we need to acknowledge that, and further recognize how land-grant institutions such as NC State have continued to profit from the land grab as part of the Morrill Act in the 1960s. This act, signed by President Lincoln, led to the violent removal of Indigenous people from their lands and selling of their lands for profit to build and fund universities across this nation, including NC State. Please check out, the slides were rotating earlier, an important discussion on the award-winning investigative story on the land grab of the Morrill Act later on this week here at NC State. In particular, there's a panel on how universities are responding to the investigative story on November 10th from 3 to 5 p.m. Now, it's my great honor to introduce Dr. Krystal Tsosie, an Indigenous geneticist and bioethicist and presidential postdoctoral fellow at Arizona State University, who is joining the faculty as an assistant professor in the School of Life Sciences in January. As an advocate for Indigenous genomic data sovereignty, she co-founded the first U.S. Indigenous-led biobank, a 501c3 nonprofit research institute called the Native BioData Consortium. She has 2 masters, one in bioethics from Arizona State and one in public health from Vanderbilt University, where she completed her Ph.D. And her research has focused on health disparities in underrepresented communities, including uterine fibroids in African American women and preeclampsia of Indigenous women. Dr. Tsosie has co-led an ongoing longitudinal genetic study in North Dakota tribal community. This project serves as one of the few examples of community-based participatory research involving genetics in an Indigenous tribal nation. She has received increasing national and international media attention as scientists worldwide are understanding the importance of equitable, community-based engagement models and the importance of Indigenous genomic data sovereignty. Her work has been covered by popular media outlets, including PBS Nova, The Washington Post, NPR, and New York Times, and I'm only naming a few. It's many, many other places. She currently serves on the Government Policy and Advocacy Committee for the American Society of Human Genetics and the National Academy of Medicine Committee on Emerging Science, Technology, and Innovation. She is the current global chair in NRICH, which focuses on enhancing Indigenous rights to develop, control, and govern Indigenous data and supports participation in STEM, an indigenously enabled future. Dr. Tsosie already has had a full day of engagement with graduate students with discussions on Indigenous genomic data sovereignty and navigating systemic racism within the academy. And she has a full day tomorrow as well, engaging with undergraduate STS program with Dr. Jason Delborn and with the GS Summer Symposium, where she will discuss Indigenous data, sovereignty, and precision medicine. And with this, I would like to give Dr. Krystal Tsosie a warm welcome to our community here at NC State.
Krystal Tsosie. Oh, excuse me, Dr. Krystal Tsosie. And it's my honor not only to be invited to speak to you here, but it is also my honor to speak to you and introduce myself to you in my Diné language, as we call Diné BioData. And what the introduction I gave to you were all of my clans, which basically tells you everything you need to know about me and everyone about my family for time immemorial in the past. And then I introduce my ancestors first before I introduce myself. So thank you so much for providing this esteemed platform by which I could be able to talk to you today about how scientists actually construct Indigenous identity using DNA. And this is from the perspective, of course, of an Indigenous geneticist. So that's hello. In Diné culture, November is actually what we call thunder winds. It's actually when the first snow falls. That's our signal that winter has begun. And in one of our northern parts of Diné or Navajo land, snow has fallen, so winter has begun. And that's important because this is a liminal time of year. It's a sacred time in which only our most powerful healing ceremonies are permitted to begin and take place. It's also the time of year in which we're able to share stories, such as what we're going to talk about in a moment. I do want to have a note on ethnonyms or group names, because I think this is incredibly important on how we bestow respect upon our Indigenous peoples and the communities and nations for which we work. I use the term Indigenous to describe global First Peoples. I reserve Native American or American Indian as political designations for some US groups. And I also encourage our bioanthropology friends to consider stopping the use of the word Amarant, because it has connotations with some really outdated racial ideologies, and wherever we can to refer to communities by their preferred names. I also do want to acknowledge that there are many ways of knowing and many Indigenous systems on which worldviews are constructed. So I only want to present my own culture and really discourage pan-indigeneity or overgeneralizations based off of what I'm going to present. And I think this is really important to also frame the fact that too often narratives are imposed or told about Indigenous peoples, and often without our consent. And they've also been told from a non-Indigenous outsider's point of view. So this type of positionality and framing is actually ultimately disempowering. So I'm hoping that by sharing with you a little bit of our origin narratives, we could take back some of that power in the narrative. So Diné is Navajo land, and the Diné people constitute the largest now federally recognized land. And the Navajo Nation has the largest land area by a Native American tribal nation in what we colonially call the United States, exceeding the size of 10 states. In 2010, in our last census, there were over 300,000 enrolled members of Navajo Nation, and this has actually expanded to now almost over $400,000 people with the CARE Act. It is incredibly important to note that we existed as a nation before federal recognition. And in 1924, I also want to acknowledge that US peoples of Indigenous nations weren't even recognized or weren't even allowed to vote as citizens. And even after 1924, many states still barred Native Americans from taking part in elections, which I think is very salient considering some upcoming dates coming up. But I just want to give a little bit of a pictorial background of how I grew up a little bit. So actually, this is Monument Valley, which many people recognize from Hollywood if you have not had the pleasure of visiting. You can kind of envision Tom Cruise kind of helicoptering in on one of the mittens. And this is actually the closest landmark to Shanto, Arizona, which is in northern Arizona, close to the Utah border. And this lower picture is my grandmother's house. It's a modern version of a hogan. A hogan is a traditional one-room dwelling that used to be made of mud brick and now is made of more modern materials. And you can't see it in this picture because it's eroded away with the wind. But it used to say flammable. We actually would heat it with huge blocks of coal and also firewood that we chop ourselves. And this gentleman he's not my grandfather, but he looks so much like my grandfather. This is a picture taken by the Navajo Water Project. And these barrels actually have water in them. And water scarcity is such a huge issue for our peoples. We used to have a huge underground aquifer system, and then our water rights were literally usurped from the ground beneath us. And it's such that our peoples have to truck our own water from wells, sometimes over an hour away or more in drought conditions. And this is incredibly important when you consider COVID. COVID really wasn't the high prevalences of COVID rates in the Navajo Nation weren't due to biological differences or some sort of predisposition to having like a lower immune function. It had everything to do with the fact that we could not have water to wash our hands to prevent the transmission of the virus, the fact that we didn't have rights and sovereignty over our own public health data, and that we didn't have our own testing facilities. So that's very important to realize when we think about health inequities. But I want to start a little bit again with our oral histories, in that our Diné elders have always acknowledged that we did not originate from the Southwestern region. We actually have relations in what is now known as Canada, really relations with the Athabascan and Diné people. And there's a lot of linguistic similarities and similarities of how we create our moccasins. But we have stories in which we actually went from the north down into what's now the Southwestern region of Arizona and Utah and New Mexico. And there's actually proof at the upper portion of Utah of some moccasins that relate to some of the tribes up north. So Diné, which I realize is being blocked by listening, is the story of the people. And Tewa scholar Gregory Kahete states that origin narratives are the way by which individuals connect with their identity and their ancestors. And in case you did not know, you are living in the fourth world right now. And the first world covered by water, we had the emergence of other animals. And then with the fourth world, it was created with first man and first woman creating changing woman, who was the first human born. And from various aspects of changing woman's body, we have a system of Ket, where from parts of her body, we had the 4 original clans. So we had Towering House from the skin of her breast, one Walk Around clan from her back, and also Totochini, which is one of my clans, and also Mud Clan. And from these clans, we have at one point over 400 clans, and now today we only have 127. Relatively speaking, though, the Diné are actually relatively recent compared to other Southwestern tribes, like compared to the Atham peoples who lived in the area in the Southwestern portion for centuries before we arrived. And unlike what some geneticists like to, how they like to depict our peoples, we had an exogamous form of marriage. We utilized the clan system to ensure we were not inbreeding, but however, that's a term that is used against us to describe us in literature. And we actually kind of acknowledge our genetic heterogeneity in a way by naming our clans by the groups from which we incorporated people. So we had Zuni clan, Hemes clan, Mexican People's Clan, Ute clan, etc. So this is a way in which we acknowledge that our identity comes from multiple peoples, which is really important because at some point recently, we had a stamp that at this point forward, you are now all 100% Navajo people. You are for forest blood quantum. And this comes from the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. So this is when the US government started moving from policies of just genocide and termination to now assimilation policies. And this is where blood quantum laws start becoming enacted. And this is where government officials go from tribal nation to tribal nation and start documenting Indigenous peoples and stamping. It doesn't matter what you were beforehand or what the peoples you incorporate into your communities were beforehand. Now you have this stamp. And there are many misconceptions of how this is conferred. It's by lineal descent. It has absolutely nothing to do with genetic ancestry. It absolutely did require some form of historical documentation. So if you were a tribe that was completely disenfranchised by land, particularly involving those communities on the eastern part of what's now the US or southeastern parts, there are just communities that frankly have vanished or have assimilated almost completely into other communities. There are also very many controversies related to genocide and structural racism, and also the substantiation of a lot of internal racism too, and that it is so internalized, this colonization, that some Indigenous peoples, frankly, utilize this system against other Indigenous peoples, such as Cherokee, the Freeman people. So Diné, in terms of our identity, we had our own system of death. And this system of blood quantum was imposed upon us as a means by which we were meant to dilute ourselves to our rights to resources. So blood quantum policy drives a wedge between members of the Native community by using blood to privilege some, discredit others, and ultimately racialize Native societies in ways that are foreign to our cultural traditions. Therefore, if we want to think about anti-colonial or decolonial notions of identity, we really need to move beyond histories that rely on blood. So I want to now introduce Dr. James Neal. He is now called or considered the father of modern genetics, and also in the school of eugenicists. And man, his work, his writing is incredibly amazing in his characterizations of Indigenous peoples as primitive peoples who belong to the Stone Age era and are now being rapidly assimilated into an atomic age, he writes in 1958. And he thinks of using primitive peoples as sort of a proxy for human evolution, in which one society is poised as a more of a modern man, those of European descent. And here he describes Indigenous peoples as a priceless opportunity to study biological selection. So here you have the beginning, well, not really the beginning, but the beginning of modern genetics also being tied with this racialization of Indigenous peoples. We have a biological construction which separates Indigenous peoples and essentializes them from other settler populations. And rather than viewing Indigenous nations as a political act related to genocide, it's constructed as an evolutionary event. And he describes in many writings as a rush to sample Indigenous people before they vanish, not caring why we are being forced to extinction, but really just we need to get their DNA and their data before they disappear off the face of the earth. So really positioning Indigenous bodies as a source of extraction. Now, I love this quote this top quote, because it really encapsulates this interest of ancient DNA researchers and paleogenomicists and biological anthropologists, persistent interest in Indigenous peoples of the US, such that the history of Native American populations is one of the most debated topics in the study of ancient human migrations. Contrast that to Indigenous communities and how they feel in that they have been researched to death. And I love thinking about these quotes because I can't stop thinking about Mariah Carey. Why are you so obsessed with me? Or, but I absolutely feel like scientists just have this weird innate obsession sometimes with Indigenous peoples and how they treat us as this font of hidden genetic variation that needs to be discovered. That was written in recent scientific literature, by the way. So now there's this rush to sample not only Indigenous peoples and contemporary descendants, but also our ancestors, utilizing sequencing technologies post-2010. So you can see this huge rapid escalation of extraction of Indigenous peoples. So on the bar graph, you can imagine a huge percentage of this actually comes from Indigenous communities in the global north and the south, and that's actually a paper that's upcoming. So it's really interesting that ego and numbers of ancient DNAs researchers kind of go hand in hand, and they like to frame this as like the ultimate research question of understanding the story of us. Well, Indigenous peoples, and I just gave you an example of one of my own, have their own constructions of where we came from. So we really don't need other people's narratives. So this really becomes more of a story of other people. And like to forget that they don't even have a unified consensus about a narrative of history, but they're so quick sometimes to privilege their own perspectives because it's supposedly rooted in science over Indigenous narratives. Ridiculous. Anyway, so I really want to take a step forward, and now we're talking not only about James Neal and talking about Indigenous bodies of sites of extraction, but now we're moving into 1990s. And this is the beginning of one of the most foundational large-scale diversity projects. And the Human Genome Diversity Project, which I will abbreviate as HGDP, when it started in 1993, was described as a race to sample Indigenous peoples before they vanished. Does that sound familiar to somebody we know? And unsurprisingly, when this project was announced, it was opposed by global Indigenous peoples who then were concerned about gene patenting and biocommercialization of biomarkers from their peoples. In 2005, HGDP published their quote unquote successful recruitment of global Indigenous populations or global groups, including 5 groups. And I want you to take a look at this map. In this magenta color sort of represents the 5 major Indigenous groups that were sampled. Do you notice anything about their geography? Okay, so we don't have US Indigenous peoples that are sampled as part of these projects because they generally have federal recognized sovereignty and they have, for many reasons, decided not to partake in the research. But we also have groups in the global South whose very existence may not be recognized by colonial authority. And they're also the most disempowered. And a lot of these communities actually denounced the Human Genographic Project in particular as a vampire project. They called it a vampire project because they viewed scientists as vampire bats or vampires coming in the middle of the night to take their blood and fly away. They were also called helicopter projects because in their purview and their perspective, researchers would fly in, helicopter in, take their blood and fly out. It's a question whether or not Indigenous peoples were even consented in their own Indigenous languages, or whether or not they had full informed consent. But, you know, there was an obvious interest in collecting and extracting DNA and data from these Indigenous peoples. Shortly after the publication of this review, there was a declaration of the rights of Indigenous peoples to genetic resources and knowledges. Basically, over 600 Indigenous groups worldwide appealed to the United Nations asking for cessation of these large-scale diversity projects, particularly citing concerns relating to co-optation and ownership of biological information, which was already culturally incongruent with how they conceptualize their own people's genomic information. We also have the rise of direct-to-consumer genetic ancestry tests. In 2008, the 23andMe test was named the Invention of the Year by Time magazine. And Ancestry began acquiring DNA collections in 2012. So we're now in November, and you can imagine that Ancestry DNA, before it was sold to a venture capital company, Blackstone, in 2018 for, no, it was 2020. They were sold for $4.7 billion. And many people, and every holiday quarter, they would have a revenue of over $1 billion. So people gifting each other the gift of history. So this is an old figure. You can actually now order a test for $59 if you wanted. But what a lot of people don't realize is that what informs these genetic ancestry tests are those populations from HDDP, 1,000 Genomes, HapMap Project. Those same populations that feel like they are researched to death. So in just a number of years, popularity of these direct-to-consumer testing companies have skyrocketed, such that the companies have been able to amass a database of collectively over 30 million people now. And so it's not just scholars that are interested in the question of who am I, but also consumers. And the number one question that Ancestry had from people utilizing their test is, why is my Native American ancestry not showing up? And oh gosh, okay. So this is problematic for many reasons. But in particular, I love this quote from Wallahaji et al., which basically very well articulated the fact that companies are promising the interchangeability of ancestral and personal identity, and that promotes a problematic causal relationship between genetics and self-identity. By drawing on public faith in science and scientific authority, consumers are now able to make statements about their own identities while believing them to be validated by genetic science. Family tree DNA is another one of these direct-to-consumer genetic ancestry tests, and interesting. Okay. Okay. This person is named Kim, and she took an ancestry test and realized that she was X% Native American. In the next scene in this video, some pots appear behind her as she becomes reacquainted with her Native American past that she had no idea she had. So anyway, before I expound on that point a little bit more, I want to take a step back because I want to acknowledge that many people actually don't understand how some of these statements are made. And a lot of these assessments of indigeneity or genetic ancestry are actually made on statistical inferences or assumptions, like a layer upon layer upon layer. So for instance, now from the collection of indigenous markers, you have the creation of reference groups. These reference groups are meant to characterize a population. And sometimes these reference groups are heavily sampled with several thousand people. Sometimes they have as few as 8 members that are meant to demonstrate, geographic characterization or genetic characterization of a people's. What people don't understand is that missing that genetic information or reference groups from indigenous peoples of the US, a lot of scientists use the next best thing, which is our indigenous peoples in Central South America, who have completely and utterly distinct genetic histories. Sometimes even early iterations of these tests use Asian, the population, also to infer US Native American ancestry. And then, you have tag snips that utilizing these groups. And already if you're using the wrong reference, right, it's kind of date crap in, crap out. All right, so let's take a different population that is considered to be admixed. Let's take African Americans. And what will happen is we will plot a principal components plot such as this, in which we'll take a couple of reference groups that are meant to be like specific to one type of ancestry. So here we have Europeans, and here we have a Yoruban population, which is a sub-Saharan group. And then we have a completely genetically distinct, according to the narrative group, Asian population. So for African Americans, you might generate a distribution from one point versus another. And sometimes scientists will say, oh, well, you have, X percentage of African American ancestry. And determinations are made by this type of dating. And there'll be an arbitrary threshold by which only some percentage of, you have to be 80% African in order for you to be characterized or included into a data set. So there's a lot of things wrong with these assumptions. So people don't understand how these statistical models are made when they make these heavy identity-based statements. So indigeneity, though, is a cultural construct. It's a political construct. It is not defined by biology. 23andMe, now, just to draw full circle, they draw from public reference databases such as HTTP, our favorite data set, HapMap, and also 1,000 genomes, and also data from consumers like us. So, what can happen when we have these biological narratives rooted in genomics? Carlos Bustamante is a very prominent human geneticist, MacArthur Genius Awardee. He actually helped Elizabeth Warren create a conclusion that she had a Native American ancestor. And the timing of this announcement was absolutely tied with her announcement that she was running for US president. So she reduced Native American indigeneity to a political ploy. And so while we as Native American geneticists do not doubt the statistical validity of these tests, we do have huge problems with the conclusion. He used in those indigenous groups from Central South America to make statements about Native American ancestry when they're completely and fundamentally different. And he stated it with such a huge certainty without also stating all of the inferences and qualifications to that statement. But that's not how the lay public understands genetic ancestry testing, and that's problematic. And I do want to state too that the Oklahoma Cherokee Nation does not acknowledge, and pretty much no US federally recognized tribe acknowledges genetic ancestry tests as sufficient for determining tribal membership. And I want to quote Dr. Kim Tallbear, who is a prominent Indigenous STS scholar, that we as Indigenous peoples construct belonging in ways that do not consider these tests. It's a matter, not just a matter of what you claim, but it's a matter of who claims you. And this is a quote from my mom, taken directly from Native Twitter or Facebook. And I like to think that I have rubbed off on her a little bit. But the salient parts are, I would never pay to have my sacred blood, my personal identification shared with this DNA test. They are bound to tell me that I'm part so-and-so, and they would be wrong. My cultural heritage is not genetically encoded. So I really want to take a step back and consider, I just came back from the American Society of Human Genetics, which is the largest meeting conference of human geneticists in the world, also co-founded by our favorite person, James Neal. And I am so astounded, actually, again, about the continued interest of geneticists that want to utilize Indigenous peoples as a demonstration of their need to demonstrate how great they are in pursuing diverse populations in their research. One thing that I didn't really fully articulate, because I didn't want to bore you with a giant table, is sometimes the way that health disparities research is done by genetic epidemiologists is they treat race and ethnicity as just another column, another covariate, just like in a logistic regression model. But how they characterize Indigenous peoples is by pooling one individual into one tribal nation bucket. And geneticists should know drift has occurred since the 1920s, 1940s, since the 1800s. Indigenous people belong to multiple nations, and those nations are also colonially constructed anyway. So we really have to think more beyond just the one person, one tribe trope, because populations are not static. We do a disservice when we default to these colonial definitions of indigeneity, when we don't acknowledge that people can have multiple tribal identities. And we do poor science when we reify indigeneity as a biological construct. We sometimes what happens too is because Indigenous peoples don't constitute like a high enough sample power to detect associations, we get sometimes either pulled into one gigantic category. Again, an Indigenous person in the Southwest will have a complete genetic history and lived experience in somebody on the East Coast, and you get mixed effects issues, which help no one, or we get dropped from data sets, and you get a form of data erasure there as well. We also have a tendency of characterizing least admixed individuals as being biologically pure. The Strong Heart study is one of the longest ongoing studies relating to US Indigenous peoples, and it's meant to look at cardiovascular risk factors in Native American populations. They have 3 sites in Oklahoma, the Dakotas, and in Arizona. And one of the central Arizona tribes decided not to partake or continue in the research anymore. So they had to remove their data set from and call back researchers to remove those populations from the data set. And researchers were annoyed. They're like, why did you remove these individuals? Now my data is skewed. Is flawed, perhaps. Maybe talking about isolated Indigenous populations, which isolated populations, Indigenous populations like this exist. But thinking about them in isolation as ideal populations is objectifying. Similarly, calling us founder populations is objectifying. And also, this goes to a certain journal editor. We should be able to acknowledge that the decimation of our peoples was due to colonial events like genocide in journal publications, and not have pushback to just whitewash it as a bottleneck effect. So what can happen when we essentialize Native Americans using genetics? Well, you had heard the trope that Native Americans are genetically predisposed to alcoholism and alcohol dependence. Well, now you have 100+ peer-reviewed articles on Native American genetics and alcoholism in PubMed. Another study, which I'm happy to say that has been rejected, but was accepted as a poster at one of the American Heart Association. They actually try to characterize nutrition of Dakota peoples based off of Native Americans in the Southwestern diet. Can you see how that could be, result in a flawed interpretation? And then here's something too. So the Otham people, you might know them more as Pima, which is their colonial name, are representative of a few communities in Central Arizona and further south. And the Tohono O'odham Nation, which are known as Papago in their colonial name, they exist in geographic space before a US-Mexico border was artificially drawn, separating their peoples. These individuals, these tribal members, lived in their lands for centuries before my people even arrived. And they had their own ways of living, their own ways of agriculture, and had a lifestyle that was absolutely fundamentally uprooted in the last 100 years when their lands were taken away from them, when the rivers were diverted away from their crops, and when a starch-rich commodity diet was imposed upon them. And unsurprisingly, rates of type 2 diabetes skyrocketed, such that the adult prevalence of type 2 diabetes in these communities is either the first or second in the world, depending on what you're looking at. But the story is that Native Americans are predisposed to diabetes. And it's almost framed in a way of blaming Native Americans for diabetes, but not looking at the environmental and colonial factors that contributed to these fundamental shifts in their health status. And here is a paper that actually kind of shows you that there are cultural factors and colonial factors at play here. So we have, again, the Akama Otham, same people, same genetic history, just unfortunately divided by this arbitrary colonial border. The Otham peoples on the Mexico side have been able to largely retain their traditional lifestyles. And the Otham peoples on the opposite side, unfortunately, have had these federal policies of assimilation. Yet there's a difference in type 2 diabetes. Is it due to genetics? Is it due to cultural factors? You would think that the responsible person would think, to move beyond these essentialized genomic narratives, but here we are. I do want to leave with a couple of points. For instance, geneticists are the worst at reading across outside of their own disciplines. Geneticists, by the way, but I like to poke a lot of fun at our field because we literally don't read across our disciplines, because if we just opened up a book or a paper by a social scientist, we would understand that social determinants of health and structural determinants of health are incredibly important for understanding health inequities. But geneticists like to say, oh, we need more DNA, we need more data to study this. But here's the thing, even if we had all the information from Indigenous peoples and their DNA, how would we implement genomic medicine when the Indian Health Services funds Indigenous patients 2.4 times less than other patients nationally per capita? So here's kind of the story that Indigenous peoples have experienced and now have been told. So on the left side, Indigenous peoples have rightfully, in some cases, disengaged from genomic research due to harm by the research. Yet, the story that we are being told by the NIH and other up-and-coming large-scale diversity projects is that we will miss out on the benefits of precision health if we do not engage. But we're not changing the factors that created those structural inequities to begin with. So we're perpetuating this cycle, and we're actually engaging in a form of coercion and victim blaming, where we don't disempower those inequities related to decision-making authority and agency with those decisions. So the focus on gene sequencing that diverts attention from other basic health requirements like food security and employment. So when we're thinking about advancing ethics and equity and justice, we have to understand that the lowest hanging fruit has already been picked. We have a wealth of understanding of common variants contributing to common disease. We also have a wealth of understanding of Mendelian factors contributing to disease. The next innovations in genomic medicine, precision medicine, health will be in rare variants, foreign variants in yet untested small populations like our own. These are the same groups that have been historically oppressed in science. So therefore, if we want to change our modus operandi moving forward, we need to empower Indigenous-led research and data decisions. Yeah, thank you so much.
That are coming up, and then we have a lot of food. But any questions?
Number one, I mean, it's so great to point out that environmental piece, because it's also using an intelligence testing, right? Oh, so we can explain 10% of this, you know, and forgetting about the environment.
Yeah.
So, but I was also just more specifically interested in how did Carlos Bustamante respond?
He never responded publicly, because he actually, it was Elizabeth Warren and her little 2-minute whatever video that said, oh, world-class geneticist, Carlos Bustamante. And that's when I was like, so.
He's done a lot of good things.
Yes.
Well,
Okay.
okay.
No, Carlos Bustamante, if you're listening, which you're not. Thank you for advancing the field and for giving statistical tools. But it's really interesting because the announcement of that was actually about the same time as the American Society of Human Genetics, which is at the end of October. So yeah, geneticists were basically looking at Carlos. What did you do? What did you do, Carlos? And he was pretty much shunned at that meeting, from what I'm told. And yeah, no problem. Really great questions.
Yeah, so I know that there's obviously a broad history, and has there been any like efforts from within Indigenous communities to like join the movement on their own terms, or?
Yeah, it depends on how you define the movement. A great question. So yeah. Let's start with the Otham peoples in central Arizona. So the Gila River Indian community and Gila River Indian community in particular, they actually withdrew from a 40+ year long study by the NIH and NIDDK to study type 2 diabetes because they thought that they were just being researched and they felt like they weren't getting anything from the research. And they also are by culture a gaming culture. So being close proximity to like a major metropolitan area, and also with the enactment of gaming laws that permitted them to make their own trailer casinos, they actually were able to utilize their economic independence to create really beautiful, like tribally run medical facilities. And they basically stated, well, if we can do this for ourselves, why do we need you all? Why do we need to wait for you to take our data? And even if you did, it would benefit all, at that point, 470 tribes and not just us, even though we're the major contributors of our data to the study. So that was one way, because null engagement is a form of exercising agency. And then, of course, there are some communities like the ones that I work with that we're working to bolster their own policy and data sharing agreements and really bolstering their legal protections so that they can have the same right to claim intellectual property as universities do. And then that way, if they want to engage, it's more on equitable terms. And there are other communities that have worked with researchers that understand these types of histories and want to do engage work in the right way, that also engage. And also stay tuned for Talk for tomorrow.
Yeah. So wanted to introduce the mentioning that NC State, one of our goals is to try and become better allies, right? So if you were to sort of give like step one advice to us, like the first step that somebody was gonna take in that direction, like where would you suggest that we sort of, take ourselves to be better allies?
Yeah, so the first step is probably one that your university legal department doesn't want me to say. But I'll give a little scenario. There's a major university medical system on the West Coast that really kind of has the legal power to muscle to ensure that tribes sort of default to their consent forms and their data sharing agreements. And it's not helped by recent changes in the common rule. So we had the Belmont Report in the 1970s that laid a bioethical framework for engaging and protecting research subjects or research participants. It got updated recently to acknowledge that tribal data sovereignty exists. And also at the same time, there was something called the single IRB mandate, which was meant to streamline the consenting process and really naming one institution's IRB or institutional review board as like the IRB of record, so that you don't have like multiple institutions having to go through different protocols. But the thing is that when it comes to tribes, it becomes sort of like whose IRB wins out. Is it the university's IRB or the tribe's IRB? So that necessitates a tribe having their own IRB, RRB to begin with. And of the 574 tribes right now, only like 33 of them have their own IRBs, right? Already disempowered. The other thing is that universities because of the Bayh-Dole Act are able to claim intellectual property on research that's done in their institution. So it's almost a standard form that they require tribes to just default to their ownership of Indigenous data. So there's a lot of problems, and you really need a really strong tribal legal team in order to develop policies and laws and resolutions so that they're both on equal playing ground. So universities could do better, perhaps, in recognizing that empowerment, and maybe also realize that Indigenous knowledges and data really are tribal entities, and really be respectful of that if they want to move health inequities moving forward. But then, of course, there are other ways of engagement and education of Indigenous peoples that I could expand upon if there are more questions, because this is a topic I could spend a lot of time on. Any other questions?
I have maybe kind of a similar question from the academic or like scientific or publishing angle. Like you mentioned all of the 150 publications. There's a lot of incentive to make publications like that.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on how we can structure some of those incentives for how Indigenous data sovereignty can get around that?
Yeah, that's also a topic I could spend a lot of time on. So academia is a publish or perish atmosphere, and too often researchers have stated, well, it takes too long to do community engagement, so I'll just go ahead and recruit urban natives because it's a lot easier rather than taking the time to do community engagement. And that happens a lot, unfortunately. And so one way to get around that is for universities to understand that if they want to do due diligence to doing the research correctly, and also avoid a lawsuit because tribes are becoming more litigious, pass that on to your university legal team. If they want to avoid another Havasupai tribe versus Arizona Board of Regents, that maybe they should give their faculty members the time and resources and training to do community engagement. When we are talking about better ways to improve training of mentees and graduate students and postdocs, building in adequate time and resources and training to impart community engaged principles and techniques, and also good qualitative research and ethnographic research methods is also important. And then the other thing that's really great is now we're starting to see for the first time in biomedicine and academic research a wealth of Indigenous scholars who are able to review peer-reviewed publications. So some of the stuff that was previously published that didn't get flagged are now able to have a little bit of more pushback. So it really relates to editors also and journals creating policies that acknowledge that they need to allow diverse researchers into the space, again, if they want to avoid lawsuits.
And potentially you're handed something to review and you don't have that cultural context reviewed.
Exactly. I'll give you an example. So a very prominent ancient DNA researcher, named David Reich, he published a book a few years ago that basically he wanted to substantiate that biological race exists in various colloquial forms. And unsurprisingly, 60 plus anthropologists wrote an open letter denouncing the book. That didn't stop him though. Ancient DNA researchers, research labs are really expensive. And it's not like ancestors who are several hundred or thousands of years old are in huge abundant quantities. So you have like a centralized power and money going into a few DNA labs around the world. So, and you have one major figure that kind of has major power in this space. And he decides, I'm going to write, since I invented the field of ancient DNA in his mind, which existed before he came on bringing sequencing technologies. Like he's like, since I wrote the field, I'm going to write the playbook for ethics. And he wrote a paper, 5 globally applicable principles of ethics for ancient DNA. And unsurprisingly, he basically stated that we're granting too much privilege to descendant communities to grant decision-making authority on research on their ancestors. And it was unsurprisingly not well received by descendant communities. And then we as Indigenous scientists, thankfully, were able to push back on that. But then it hasn't stopped their group from trying to publish more ethical guidelines. And thankfully, some of those efforts have been rejected. And that's because people are now starting to understand the importance of community engagement and doing the right thing.
I know that this will be a really difficult list to pick from, but given that, is there anything we can learn from other settler colonies and how they have dealt their own indigenous populations? Because I don't know how Denmark, for instance, deals with its own indigenous populations. In Greenland, is there anything that
Yeah, these are different spaces with their own politics and sometimes better healthcare systems. So space of health inequities just looks fundamentally different. So I would say if we should be learning anything is from the Maori populations. They have definitely advanced a lot of the ethics and rhetoric, and they are 2 decades above in front of everyone in terms of thinking about DNA, indigeneity, and how to actually do community engagement and building institutions and computational approaches that respects cultural provenance and ownership and stewardship of data. So I absolutely look to them, and a lot of Maori geneticists are leading spaces in quite a number of ways. I also do want to acknowledge that our Indigenous researchers from the Global South are up and coming. One thing that was interesting is that one of them shared with me recently is because they often don't get access to their own ancestors because, well, the cabal of ancient DNA researchers getting first dibs, that they're really good with computational approaches. And that's actually becoming especially relevant with machine learning approaches and also using, for instance, blockchain and federated models to create more advanced systems of data sharing and also data governance. So I'm also really excited on that front too. And I also published a paper in Cell about that, and also an upcoming one coming up in Nature Machine Intelligence. Yeah. Thank you. And then one last thing, I think you are all firmly ensconced in your PhD programs, but if you're looking for a postdoc position or just want to collaborate, email right here, now to the Muses Lab for Digital Genomics.
Awesome.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much.